Picture this, the year is 1309, and the heart of Christendom is in chaos. Pope Clement V, under immense pressure from the French crown, makes a decision that will shake the foundations of the Catholic Church. He abandons Rome and moves the papal court to the quiet town of Avignon in southern France. On the surface, it might seem like a simple relocation, a matter of safety or convenience, but behind the scenes, something far more sinister was taking shape. This wasn't just a change of address, it was the beginning of what many would later call the Church's Babylonian Captivity, a 68-year period where the papacy wasn't just residing in Avignon. It was effectively held hostage by political machinations, secret deals, and a web of power that reached into the highest corridors of Europe. Why would a pope willingly uproot the spiritual center of Christianity? The answer lies in the shadows, where faith collided with greed and sacred authority was twisted into a tool for control. Avignon became more than a new home for the church. It became a fortress of financial schemes, a stage for backroom alliances, and a battleground where kings and cardinals fought for dominance. The lavish palace built there wasn't just a residence, it was a symbol of a papacy entangled in worldly ambitions, far removed from its spiritual roots. And while the official narrative spoke of stability and renewal, whispers of corruption and manipulation swirled through the halls of power. This is the untold story of the Avignon Papacy, a tale of hidden agendas, whispered conspiracies, and the dramatic struggle for the soul of the church itself. Over the next few minutes, we'll peel back the layers of history to uncover what really happened during those turbulent decades. Who were the puppet masters pulling the strings? How did money and politics distort the sacred office of the Pope? And most importantly, what lasting scars did this era leave on the church and the world? Strap in, because the truth is far stranger and far darker than you've been led to believe. The real story of Avignon is about to begin. To understand why the papacy uprooted itself from Rome, we have to step back into the bloody power struggles of the early 14th century. Europe was still reeling from the Crusades, once a holy mission, now a crumbling dream, leaving kingdoms exhausted and the church's authority frayed. But nothing strained the relationship between throne and altar more than the bitter feud between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France. Their clash wasn't just personal, it was a war over who held real power, the spiritual might of the church or the growing strength of secular rulers. Philip, nicknamed the Fair for his looks but not his tactics, pushed back hard against church influence. He taxed clergy, ignored papal decrees, and even arrested a bishop to assert royal dominance. Boniface, a fiery and uncompromising leader, responded with a bull, a formal papal decree declaring that kings must submit to the Pope's authority in all matters, spiritual and political. The message was clear: the church would not bow. Then came the infamous incident at Anagni in 1303. Philip's agents stormed Boniface's palace, dragging the 86-year-old pope from his chambers. Some accounts say he was struck, others that he was held at sword point. Though locals eventually freed him, the humiliation broke Boniface. He died weeks later, and whispers spread: had the French king murdered a pope? The message was sent: defy secular power, and even the holiest office wasn't safe. With Boniface gone, Philip moved swiftly. He pressured the next pope, Benedict XI, but when Benedict resisted French control, his reign lasted just 8 months before his sudden and suspicious death. Then came Clement V, a former archbishop with deep ties to the French court. His election wasn't just political, it was a surrender. Rome had become a battleground between noble factions, and Clement, seeking stability, made his fateful decision. The papacy would relocate to Avignon, a small but strategic town nestled along the Rhone River. On paper, Avignon was neutral, technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, not France, but in reality, it was a carefully chosen chess move. Far from Rome's violent streets, yet close enough for Philip to watch over, it became the perfect stage for a puppet papacy. The Church's independence, won over centuries, now hung by a thread, and the consequences would echo through history. Control had shifted not through theology, but through fear, gold, and the quiet turning of keys in a French lock. Pope Clement V stands at the center of one of history's great debates. Was he a weak-willed puppet dancing to France's tune, or a calculating strategist playing the long game? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows. His election in 1305 was no accident. King Philip IV of France had spent years stacking the College of Cardinals with allies, ensuring the next pope would be pliable. Clement, born Raymond Bertrand de Got, was no outsider. He'd risen through French ecclesiastical ranks, serving as Archbishop of Bordeaux. To his critics, he was the perfect pawn, a man whose loyalty to the crown outweighed his duty to Rome. But dig deeper, and a more complex portrait emerges. Take the Knights Templar. In 1307, Philip launched a brutal crackdown on the legendary order, arresting Templars across France on trumped-up charges of heresy and blasphemy. The king's motives were transparent. The Templars were fabulously wealthy, and he owed them staggering debts. Clement initially resisted, issuing bulls to defend the order's rights. But when Philip turned up the pressure threatening schism, even violence, the Pope relented, disbanding the Templars in 1312. On the surface, it looks like sheer capitulation. Yet some historians argue Clement played a desperate hand skillfully. By dragging out the trials, he ensured Templar assets flowed into church coffers, not royal treasuries. He even granted asylum to Templar leaders in Avignon, shielding them from execution. Was this weakness or a quiet act of defiance? Then there's Avignon itself. Yes, the move gave Philip unprecedented influence, but it also allowed Clement to consolidate papal power in ways Rome never permitted. In Italy, popes were at the mercy of warring noble families and street mobs. Avignon offered stability, and with it the chance to reform church administration. Clement established a centralized bureaucracy, streamlined finances, and even expanded papal jurisdiction. Under his watch, the papacy became less a spiritual emblem and more a functioning government. Some argue this ruthless efficiency saved the church from collapse during a turbulent era. Others see it as the moment the Vatican became a political machine, trading moral authority for cold pragmatism. So who was Clement really? Perhaps both narratives hold truth. He navigated an impossible tightrope, balancing survival against principle, temporary concessions against long-term gains. In the end, his legacy is as fractured as the era he ruled, a pope who preserved the Church's power while surrendering its soul. The Avignon Papacy didn't begin with a masterstroke or a surrender. It began with a man trapped between heaven and earth, making choices that would haunt Christianity for centuries. The Palais des Papes in Avignon wasn't just a building, it was a declaration. Towering over the Rhone River, its massive stone walls and battlements sent an unmistakable message. This was no retreat but a fortress of power. Construction began under Pope Benedict XII in 1335, and by the time it was finished, the palace sprawled across nearly 3 acres, making it the largest Gothic building in Europe. But behind its grandeur lay a darker purpose. Every archway, every vaulted hall was designed not just for worship but for control. Step inside and you'd find more than chapels and courtyards. Hidden passages snaked through the walls, connecting private chambers to secret meeting rooms. The papal treasury, guarded like a royal vault, held not just sacred relics but meticulous records, lists of benefactors, debts, and some say bribes. This was where the church's finances became a weapon. Taxes flowed in from every corner of Christendom, and Avignon's bureaucrats perfected the art of extracting wealth, selling indulgences, appointing bishops for a price, even charging for legal appeals to the Pope himself. The palace wasn't just a home, it was an engine of revenue, turning faith into currency. Then there were the whispers, late-night gatherings in windowless rooms where cardinals huddled with French envoys. Rumors swirled that deals were struck here, titles traded, rivals silenced, even assassinations plotted. One persistent legend claims a hidden chamber beneath the palace held documents so explosive they were burned when the papacy finally returned to Rome. Whether true or not, the stories stuck because they fit a pattern. The Avignon popes didn't just rule the church, they ran it like a court, complete with spies, informants, and a web of loyalties tied to gold. And the symbols were everywhere. Frescoes depicted not just saints, but popes receiving tribute from kneeling monarchs. The throne room, deliberately positioned above the treasury, forced visitors to climb a staircase, literally ascending to the pope's presence, a physical reminder of who held the higher authority. Even the gardens, lush and enclosed, were a metaphor, a paradise walled off from the world where power grew in carefully tended rows. By the time the last Avignon pope packed his bags in 1403, the palace stood as a monument to an era of blurred lines between faith and politics, piety and pragmatism. Today, tourists walk its halls unaware of the secrets buried in the stones. But if walls could talk, they'd tell a story not of divine mission, but of a church that built its own cage and called it a throne. The financial machinery of the Avignon Papacy didn't just fund the church, it reinvented it as Europe's first true multinational corporation. At its peak, the papal treasury wasn't merely collecting donations. It was running a ruthless, precision-engineered system designed to extract wealth from every corner of Christendom. Take the annats, for example, a revolutionary and controversial tax that required newly appointed bishops to hand over their first full year of income to Avignon. On the surface, it was framed as a spiritual offering, a way to support the Holy See. But in practice, it became a staggering revenue stream, draining local dioceses dry while lining the pockets of papal bureaucrats. And when bishops resisted, their appointments could mysteriously vanish, replaced by more generous candidates. Then came the tithes, no longer voluntary contributions, but mandatory payments enforced with the threat of excommunication. The Avignon popes declared so-called crusade taxes to fund wars against their political enemies, even when no actual crusades were being fought. Peasants and princes alike grumbled as their coins vanished into Avignon's coffers, with little to show for it beyond cryptic receipts stamped with papal seals. But the real masterstroke was the sale of indulgences certificates promising reduced time in purgatory for sins, priced according to the buyer's wealth. A nobleman might pay hundreds of gold florins to cleanse his soul, while a peasant offered chickens or grain. The theology was murky at best, but the profit margins were crystal clear. Behind the scenes, Avignon's clerks perfected accounting techniques that wouldn't become standard in secular banks for centuries. Double-entry bookkeeping tracked every transaction, while networks of Italian bankers acting as papal agents moved money across borders with letters of credit. The system was so efficient that during one fiscal year in the 1340s, records show the papacy's income exceeded that of the French and English crowns combined. But wealth bred corruption. Positions within the church became commodities auctioned off to the highest bidder. A bishopric wasn't earned through piety, it was bought like a parcel of land, often by nobles who treated it as an investment. And then there were the shadows, the unofficial fees, the whispered bribes. A chronicler from the time describes cardinals receiving chests of silver to ease the burden of decision-making, while petitioners learned that their cases moved faster with gifts to the right officials. The Vatican archives still hold ledgers where payments are discreetly labeled as charitable donations, though the amounts match suspiciously precise legal outcomes. This wasn't just corruption, it was institutionalized, with Avignon's bureaucracy developing coded language to hide the flow of money behind a veil of piety. By the time the papacy returned to Rome, the church had amassed a fortune, but at what cost? The financial innovations of Avignon saved the institution from collapse, yet they also tethered spiritual authority to cold, hard currency. Faith became a transaction, salvation a product with a price tag, and the resentment this bred would fester for generations until it finally ignited into flames during the Protestant Reformation. The Avignon popes didn't just build a palace, they built an empire of gold, one that would weigh heavily on the conscience of Christianity for centuries to come. By the time Pope Clement V settled into Avignon, the College of Cardinals, the sacred body tasked with electing new popes, had already begun to transform into something unrecognizable. What was once a diverse assembly of Europe's most devout churchmen now tilted dangerously toward French dominance. Records from the period reveal a staggering shift. Between 1305 and 1378, the number of French cardinals ballooned from a handful to over 2/3 of the college. This wasn't happenstance, it was a calculated takeover, one vote at a time. King Philip IV and his successors understood the game perfectly. Control the cardinals and you control the papacy. French bishops and nobles were quietly elevated to the red hat, their loyalties carefully vetted. Some were outright relatives of the royal family, others owed their fortunes to French patronage. The result, a voting bloc so powerful that papal elections became less a matter of divine inspiration and more a foregone conclusion. And when non-French candidates dared to challenge the status quo, the consequences were swift. In 1316, a rare Italian candidate, Jacques de Vire, died suddenly just weeks after his election, conveniently clearing the way for another French pope. Coincidence, maybe, but the pattern was undeniable. Behind the scenes, the deals grew darker. Chronicles from Avignon describe secret meetings in candlelit chambers where promises of land, titles, and even cold hard cash exchanged hands. One cardinal wrote privately of gifts arriving at his doorstep the night before a crucial vote, chests of silver for the good of the church, accompanied by thinly veiled reminders of what might happen if loyalty wavered. Another account tells of a Spanish cardinal who refused to bend, only to find his family's land suddenly reassigned to a French ally. The message was clear: resistance came with a price. But the French crown didn't stop at intimidation. They mastered the art of bureaucratic manipulation. By flooding the college with their own, they ensured every papal decree, every appointment, bore the fingerprints of French influence. Even seemingly neutral decisions like assigning bishoprics or approving monastic reforms were filtered through this lens. At one point, the Avignon Papacy appointed so many French bishops to German and Italian dioceses that local clergy revolted, accusing the church of treating spiritual offices like spoils of war. And then there were the shadow alliances, unofficial pacts woven through marriage, debt, and mutual interest. The infamous Limousin affair exposed how a group of cardinals secretly swore oaths to the French crown, pledging to vote as a bloc in exchange for royal protection. When the pact was discovered, the Pope, himself French, merely shrugged. The system was working as intended. By the 1340s, the College of Cardinals had become a mirror of Avignon itself, outwardly pious, inwardly political. Elections were less about choosing Christ's vicar and more about maintaining equilibrium, keeping the gold flowing, the peace intact, and France firmly in control. The irony was crushing. The very men tasked with safeguarding the Church's independence had become the architects of its captivity. And as the decades passed, the question grew louder: could the papacy ever break free, or was it forever chained to the ambitions of kings? The answer would come, but not before the Church paid a steep price for its silence. Pope John XXII didn't just rule from Avignon, he ruled with an iron fist wrapped in sacred vestments. Elected in 1316, he inherited a papacy already deeply entangled with French interests, but where his predecessors had navigated political currents, John dove headfirst into theological warfare. His target, the spiritual Franciscans, a radical faction within the order that preached absolute poverty, claiming Christ and the apostles had owned nothing, a direct challenge to the Church's growing wealth. What followed wasn't just a debate over doctrine, it was a purge dressed in dogma, a campaign so vicious it would redefine heresy hunting for centuries. To understand why John reacted so fiercely, you have to grasp the stakes. The spirituals weren't merely arguing about possessions, they were attacking the very foundation of Avignon's power. If the church couldn't own property, how would it fund its palaces, its armies, its bureaucrats? Worse, their teachings resonated with the masses, ordinary people disillusioned by a clergy living in luxury while preaching humility. This was rebellion disguised as piety, and John saw it for what it was, an existential threat. His response was swift and brutal. In 1317, he issued the bull Ad Conditorum Canonum, stripping the Franciscans of their legal right to poverty. No longer could they claim to use goods while the church technically owned them, a loophole that had allowed the order to maintain its austere image. Now they'd have to accept full ownership just like everyone else. When the spirituals refused, John doubled down. He labeled their stance heretical, ordering inquisitors to hunt them down. Monasteries were raided, books burned, and defiant friars dragged before tribunals. Some were imprisoned, others, like the famous theologian Peter Olivi, saw their writings condemned posthumously, their bones exhumed and scattered as warnings. But here's where it gets murky. Was this really about faith, or was heresy just a convenient excuse? John's obsession with control went beyond theology. He centralized authority like no pope before him, demanding bishops seek papal approval for even minor decisions. He expanded the Inquisition's reach, turning it into a weapon against not just heretics but political rivals. And then there's the money. Under John, the sale of indulgences exploded, and church taxes grew so oppressive that even kings complained. Coincidence, or was the heresy of poverty dangerous precisely because it threatened the golden engine fueling Avignon? The climax came in 1323 when John made a staggering claim. Even the saints in heaven didn't yet enjoy the full vision of God, a doctrine so controversial that it sparked riots in Paris. Theologians accused him of heresy himself, and for once the French crown turned against him. Facing revolt, John was forced to recant on his deathbed. It's a telling moment, the heresy hunter undone by his own zeal. So who was John the 22nd, a defender of orthodoxy or a tyrant using doctrine as a cudgel? Perhaps both. His reign laid bare the hypocrisy at Avignon's heart, a papacy that preached spiritual purity while amassing earthly power. And in silencing the spirituals, he didn't just crush dissent, he proved their point. The church wasn't just rich, it was willing to burn anyone who said that was a problem. The Inquisition under the Avignon popes wasn't just about rooting out heresy, it was a political weapon masquerading as divine justice. What began as a tool to combat religious dissent morphed into something far darker, a machine for silencing critics, settling scores, and consolidating power. Take the case of Bishop Gichard of Troyes, a once respected clergyman who found himself in the crosshairs of Philip the Fair. Accused of witchcraft and poisoning a queen. Charges so absurd even contemporaries rolled their eyes. Gichard was hauled before an inquisitorial tribunal in 1308. The trial had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with his opposition to French interference in church lands. For 5 years, he endured torture, forced confessions, and public humiliation before finally being mercifully exiled to a monastery. His real crime defying the crown. Then there were the Templars, their destruction framed as a holy purge but orchestrated like a royal shakedown. Under pressure from Philip, inquisitors extracted confessions through methods that would make modern interrogators blanch. Sleep deprivation, the rack, even the infamous strappado, where victims were suspended by their wrists behind their backs until joints dislocated. One knight described being shown the instruments of torture first, then asked if he'd like to reconsider his testimony. The trials weren't investigations, they were theatrical performances with predetermined endings. By the time the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, the message was clear across the wrong powers, and even the Church's highest protections wouldn't save you. But the Inquisition's reach extended beyond famous cases. In the countryside, petty vendettas were sanctified with heresy accusations, a land dispute between neighbors. Accuse one of harboring Waldensian beliefs. A rival monk eyeing your abbey's revenues whisper that he'd questioned transubstantiation. The system became so corrupt that in 1325, Pope John XXII had to issue a decree warning inquisitors against fabricating charges for profit. The irony was lost on no one. The most chilling twist, the paper trail. Avignon's bureaucrats meticulously documented every arrest, every confession, every execution, not for accountability but as leverage. Files on nobles and clergy were kept like ledgers, pulled out when loyalty wavered. In one recently uncovered letter, a cardinal writes of reminding a German bishop of his nephew's unfortunate views on papal authority just before a crucial vote. The Inquisition didn't just burn bodies, it burned reputations, futures, and any hope of dissent. By the time the papacy returned to Rome, the damage was done. The Inquisition had become a shadow government, its methods so entrenched that they'd outlive Avignon itself. What started as a sword against heresy ended as a scalpel for political surgery, cutting out opposition with precision, all in the name of saving souls. The real heresy, it seemed, was daring to question who held the knife. When Benedict XII ascended to the papal throne in 1334, Avignon's transformation from temporary refuge to permanent power center reached its peak. Known as the Builder Pope, Benedict poured staggering sums into construction, not just the iconic Palais des Papes, but a network of fortified monasteries stretching from Provence to the edges of Christendom. Officially, these stone-walled retreats were sanctuaries for prayer and scholarship, but the architecture tells a different story. High towers offered sweeping views of surrounding lands, while underground tunnels connected cloisters to nearby roads perfect for discreet movement. And then there were the letter chambers, small, soundproof rooms where scribes labored day and night, copying correspondence that flowed between Avignon and every corner of Europe. Prayer or surveillance, the line blurred. Take the Abbey of St. Michel de Frigolet, nestled in Provence' rocky hills. Its records show an unusual number of visiting clerics from Germany and Italy, all hosted in cells with direct access to the abbot's private study. Local shepherds reported couriers arriving at odd hours, their saddlebags stuffed with sealed packets rather than devotional texts, even more telling. Benedict appointed his own nephew as the abbey's treasurer, a man with no monastic training but extensive experience in the papal spy network that had quietly expanded under John XXII. Then there's the curious case of Montmajour Abbey near Arles. Its thick walls and iron gates resembled a fortress more than a place of worship, complete with a garrison of armed monks dubbed the Pope's Guard. Chroniclers of the time noted how the abbey's scriptorium produced not just illuminated manuscripts but detailed maps of regional noble estates, annotations marking which families opposed Avignon's rule. When a group of Catalan bishops protested church taxes in 1338, records show their letters were intercepted at Montmajour weeks before they mysteriously vanished from their lodgings. Benedict's defenders argue he was simply protecting church interests in unstable times. The 100 Years' War had begun and bandits roamed the countryside. But others point to the black ledgers discovered centuries later in Avignon's archives, lists of informants paid from papal funds, coded as alms for the faithful. One entry details payments to a Benedictine prior in Vienna for tidings of the Duke's intentions, while another rewards a Florentine banker for news of the Pisans' discontent. Spiritual oversight or espionage, the answer may lie in Benedict's own words. In a private letter to a cardinal, he wrote, "He who rules blindly rules briefly." The monasteries weren't just shelters for souls, they were watchtowers in a silent war for control, one where information proved deadlier than any sword. When the Black Death swept through Europe in 1348, leaving corpses piled in streets and entire villages erased, the Avignon Papacy faced a crisis it couldn't tax or intimidate away. As panic spread faster than the disease itself, Pope Clement VI and his court scrambled for answers, but not the kind that involved medicine or compassion. Instead, they turned to an ancient playbook. Divine wrath demanded human scapegoats. The result, a chilling campaign of blame that targeted Jews, lepers, and so-called heretics, transforming fear into fury and desperation into bloodshed. The first whispers began in the spring of 1348, claims that Jews had poisoned wells to spread the plague. Never mind that Jewish communities were dying at the same horrific rates as their Christian neighbors. Logic dissolved in the face of terror, and the papal court, rather than challenging the hysteria, stoked it. Clement's bull Quamvis Perfidium, issued that summer, was a masterpiece of doublespeak. On the surface, it condemned violence against Jews, urging Christians not to take justice into their own hands. But buried in the text was a far darker implication. The Church acknowledged Jews were being accused, and by extension, that their guilt was plausible enough to require an official response. The message was clear: the accusations weren't baseless, just premature. Meanwhile, in Avignon's shadow, local bishops and inquisitors took the hint. In Strasbourg, nearly 1,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day, their property divided between the city council and the church. In Mainz, 6,000 perished after being accused of spreading pestilence through sorcery. Survivors described clergymen moving through crowds with ledgers, noting who donated generously to the church and who might be suspect. Conveniently, the wealthiest Jewish families often found themselves on the latter list. But the scapegoating didn't stop there. Lepers, long marginalized as unclean, were rounded up and executed en masse under claims they'd conspired with Muslim rulers to spread the plague. Heretics, anyone from Waldensians to Franciscan mystics, were dragged before tribunals, their crimes suddenly tied to God's punishment. In one grotesque twist, the papal legate in Provence declared the plague was divine retribution for tolerating heresy, then charged towns hefty fees for spiritual cleansing ceremonies. The sickness wasn't just a tragedy, it was a revenue stream. What makes this moment particularly sinister is the paper trail. Avignon's meticulous records show deliberate calculus. Letters between Clement and his cardinals discuss how to channel popular anger away from the papacy's own failures, like its inability to protect or even comfort the faithful. One memo suggests redirecting blame to external enemies to preserve the unity of the flock. Translation: let the mob tear apart the vulnerable so they don't turn on us. The Black Death should have been a moment for the Church to lead with mercy. Instead, it became a case study in how power preserves itself by feeding the hungry flames of superstition and hate. Long after the plague faded, the scars remained. Jewish communities decimated, distrust sown deeper, and the grim lesson that when fear reigns, the powerful will always find someone to sacrifice. The Avignon Papacy didn't just fail its people, it betrayed them, and in doing so, it wrote one of history's darkest chapters, not with a quill but with torches and blood. Pope Clement VI didn't just live in Avignon, he turned it into a spectacle of excess that would make Roman emperors blush. While the Black Death ravaged Europe outside his walls, inside the Palais des Papes, the halls echoed with laughter, music, and the clinking of golden goblets. Chroniclers of the time described feasts where peacocks were roasted in their plumage, wine flowed from fountains, and guests reclined on cushions stuffed with rare Eastern spices. But the most scandalous whispers centered on the private chambers, where rumors of orgies swirled, so much so that Petrarch, the famed poet and critic, dubbed Avignon the Babylon of the West, a den of sin masquerading as Christ's kingdom on earth. Yet beneath this glittering facade, Clement was playing a political game so cunning it would redefine papal diplomacy. The 100 Years' War between England and France wasn't just a conflict of crowns, it was a minefield the Church had to navigate without blowing itself apart. Officially, Avignon backed France, the very nation that had hosted and, critics said, hijacked the papacy, but private letters tell another story. In 1344, secret envoys slipped into Clement's chambers bearing offers from England's Edward III. The Pope, ever the pragmatist, listened, because while public allegiance was one thing, survival required hedging bets. What followed was a masterclass in double-dealing. Clement publicly condemned English incursions into French territory, while quietly guaranteeing Edward that church loans to France wouldn't fund military campaigns. He brokered truces that favored French interests, but only after securing promises from Paris to expand papal privileges in Normandy. Even his lavish spending had a purpose. The gold-embroidered robes and jeweled mitres weren't just vanity, they were armor. By presenting himself as a monarch in all but name, Clement forced warring kings to treat the papacy as an equal player, not just a spiritual figurehead. The climax came in 1346 when he pulled off his boldest maneuver yet. As French and English armies massed near Calais, Clement hosted a summit disguised as a prayer conference. Behind locked doors, he offered both sides a deal. The Church would recognize Edward's claimed French territories if Edward withdrew support from rebellious German princes threatening Avignon's allies. No signed treaties, no public concessions, just a whispered agreement that left both kings feeling they'd won. It was diplomacy by shadow, proving Clement understood a hard truth. In war, the real power often lies with whoever holds the keys to the backroom. So was Clement VI a debauched hedonist or a strategic genius? The answer is both. His feasts weren't just indulgences, they were theaters of influence where rivals could be softened by wine before being outmaneuvered. His gold wasn't just greed, it was a language kings understood. In an era where faith and power were tangled beyond separation, Clement mastered the art of wielding both. The tragedy, his successors would inherit his extravagance without his cunning, turning Avignon's twilight into a slow unraveling of everything he'd built. The line between brilliance and decadence had never been thinner or more dangerous. The Avignon Papacy didn't just pray for protection, it paid for it, turning sacred gold into soldiers' wages. When the 100 Years' War left France's countryside crawling with unemployed knights and desperate swordsmen, the Popes saw an opportunity. Instead of disbanding these dangerous bands, they hired them, transforming outlaw mercenaries into something far more shocking: the Vatican's private army. Known as the Great Companies, these roving bands of armored thugs became the enforcers of papal will, their loyalty purchased with the same indulgences sold to peasants seeking salvation. Take the infamous White Company, led by the ruthless English condottiero John Hawkwood. Officially, they were defenders of Christendom, contracted to guard Avignon's borders. But their real mission was far darker. When the Pope needed to pressure a rebellious Italian city-state, Hawkwood's men would descend like wolves burning crops, sacking towns, and leaving behind a trail of carefully calculated terror. Survivors reported seeing the company's banners adorned with papal insignia, a grim irony as they extorted protection fees from local bishops, even more damning. Avignon's own financial records show regular payments to Hawkwood labeled "Alms for the Faithful." But the mercenaries' most audacious scam was the protection racket disguised as piety. In 1365, Pope Urban V issued a bull offering full forgiveness of sins to any soldier who pledged to defend the Church's lands. Translation: pillage your enemies and we'll call it a crusade. The result: mercenary captains like Arnaud de Serval, nicknamed the Archpriest for his former clerical rank, led raids so brutal entire regions paid tribute just to be spared. When villagers in Provence couldn't scrape together enough coin, de Serval's men reportedly forced priests to sign IOUs drawn on church coffers. the darkest twist. These mercenaries didn't just serve the Pope, they mirrored him. Just as Avignon extracted wealth through spiritual fear, the companies extracted it through physical terror. Both systems ran on the same engine, exploitation dressed in holy vestments, and when the mercenaries grew too bold, like the time Hawkwood threatened to sack Avignon itself, the popes simply bought them off, redirecting them to raid rivals instead. By the 1400s, the fallout was undeniable. The very armies the papacy had funded now haunted Europe, their violence eroding what little moral authority Avignon had left. The lesson was clear: when faith becomes a currency, even salvation has a price, and it's paid in blood. The year 1367 should have marked a turning point, the moment when the Avignon Papacy finally broke free from France's grip and returned to its rightful home in Rome. Pope Urban V, a Benedictine monk known for his austerity, seemed like the perfect reformer to lead the church back to its roots. His decision to leave Avignon after nearly 6 decades wasn't just symbolic. It was a direct challenge to the system that had turned the papacy into a French puppet. But beneath the triumphant processions and public declarations lay a far messier truth. Urban's move was less about spiritual renewal and more about a desperate bid to salvage the Church's crumbling legitimacy. From the start, the French cardinals resisted. Private letters from the time reveal frantic meetings in Avignon's back rooms, where whispers of betrayal and folly swirled. One cardinal, Jean de Blauzac, reportedly cornered Urban, warning that abandoning Avignon would mean losing French protection and, more importantly, French gold. The threat wasn't subtle. The papal treasury relied on revenues from French-controlled bishoprics, and without those funds, the church risked financial collapse. Even Urban's own advisors were divided. Some argued Rome's chaotic streets, still scarred by feuding noble factions, were no place for a pope. Others, like the Spanish Cardinal Gil Álvarez Carrillo de Albornoz, urged boldness, insisting the Church's future depended on reclaiming its independence. Yet Urban pressed ahead, arriving in Rome to cheering crowds in October 1367. The symbolism was potent, the Pope walking the halls of the Lateran Palace, celebrating Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. Gestures meant to signal a return to tradition, but the reality was anything but stable. Within months, reports surfaced of French agents sabotaging the effort. Funds for Rome's reconstruction mysteriously dried up. Italian nobles who'd pledged support suddenly backed away, their loyalties reconsidered after private meetings with French envoys. Even the Roman mobs, initially jubilant, grew restless as promises of prosperity failed to materialize. The final blow came in 1370 when Urban, facing open revolt in the Papal States and a French-backed coup plot, fled back to Avignon. The official excuse, his health; the truth, he'd been outmaneuvered. French cardinals greeted his return with smug silence, while the papal court quietly resumed business as usual. Urban's great reform had lasted less than 3 years, a fleeting interruption in Avignon's reign. His death just months later, some said of a broken heart, served as a grim epitaph for the attempt. So was Urban's move genuine or just theater? The answer lies in the aftermath. While he'd publicly framed the return as a moral duty, his private correspondence hints at deeper calculations. Letters to Emperor Charles IV suggest Urban hoped to leverage German support against French dominance, and by temporarily relocating, he'd forced Europe to remember that the papacy wasn't meant to be a French satellite. But in the end, the system proved too entrenched. The real lesson of Urban's failure wasn't about one pope's weakness, it was about the sheer weight of the machinery behind him. A machine built over decades to keep the church right where France wanted it, close, compliant, and under control. Pope Gregory XI sat on a throne built by pragmatists, but it was a mystic who would shake his certainty. Catherine of Siena, an uneducated daughter of a cloth dyer, became one of history's most unlikely power brokers, a woman whose fiery letters and reported visions cut through Avignon's political fog like a knife. When she first arrived in 1376, barefoot and draped in the rough wool of a Dominican tertiary, the papal court dismissed her as another hysteric. But within months, even hardened cardinals leaned in when she spoke. Her message was unwavering. God's wrath would burn Avignon to ashes unless the Pope returned to Rome. The question historians still debate is whether Gregory truly believed her, or if he saw in Catherine a convenient vessel for his own agenda. By the 1370s, the Avignon Papacy was hemorrhaging credibility. Italian city-states openly mocked it as a French puppet, withholding taxes and flirting with schism. The papal treasury, once overflowing, now faced empty coffers as Florence and Milan dared to challenge church authority. Meanwhile, Catherine's growing following among the poor made her a grassroots force impossible to ignore. Her letters to Gregory walked a razor's edge between devotion and threat, blending spiritual ecstasy with sharp political insight. "Do not make yourself a stranger to Rome," she wrote, "for the world is rotting without its father." Then came the revolts. In 1375, Florence's War of the Eight Saints saw the city seize church lands and imprison clergymen, declaring the Avignon popes illegitimate. Gregory's excommunications bounced off the rebels like rain until Catherine arrived. Witnesses describe her walking unarmed into the rebel stronghold, emerging with a truce brokered not through diplomacy, but through what she called the sword of truth. Suddenly, Gregory had proof her influence could quell the very uprisings his armies couldn't. Behind closed doors, the calculus grew clearer. Catherine's visions provided divine cover for what was at heart a survival move. Returning to Rome would reclaim the moral high ground, undercutting rebel claims of a corrupt French papacy. But the risks were enormous. French cardinals whispered that leaving Avignon meant walking into an Italian trap where Gregory might find himself a prisoner in all but name. Catherine countered with apocalyptic prophecies, dreams of Avignon drowning in blood, of a church split asunder. On September 13, 1376, Gregory made his choice. With Catherine beside him, he boarded a ship in Marseille only to hesitate at the last moment, delaying the voyage for months. The pause speaks volumes. Was it fear or a final negotiation with French backers? When he finally entered Rome in January 1377, the jubilant crowds couldn't mask the truth. This homecoming was no triumph but a gambit. Within a year, Catherine would be dead at 33, possibly poisoned by factions threatened by her influence. Gregory, besieged by renewed revolts and French sabotage, followed her to the grave in 1378, his last words reportedly begging for Avignon. In the end, their relationship defies easy labels. Catherine's spiritual fervor was genuine, but it also served Gregory's need for a divine mandate to break French chains. Her visions gave him what no army could, permission to choose Rome without appearing weak. Yet the tragic irony lingers. Both sought to heal the church, but their alliance only hastened the great schism that would fracture Christendom for decades. The mystic and the Pope had gambled on a miracle, only to learn that even visions can't outrun the weight of power. Gregory XI's death in 1378 didn't just mark the end of an era, it ignited a powder keg that had been filling with Avignon's political gunpowder for decades. The cardinals, split between French loyalists and reformers, faced an impossible choice: elect a pope who would return to Rome or one who'd restore Avignon's glory. What followed was less an election than a brawl, with mobs rioting outside the conclave chanting, "Give us a Roman or give us blood." Under pressure, the cardinals compromised on Urban VI, an Italian known for his temper but also his vow to keep the papacy in Rome. Within months, they regretted it. Urban, perhaps sensing their wavering loyalties, turned tyrannical, threatening to torture dissenting cardinals. That's when the French faction made their move. Fleeing Rome, they declared Urban's election invalid, claiming fear had swayed their votes, and crowned their own pope, Clement VII, who promptly settled back into Avignon's gilded palace. The church now had two heads, each claiming to be Christ's true vicar. Urban excommunicated Clement. Clement returned the favor. suddenly every kingdom in Europe had to pick a side. France, Scotland, and Castile backed Avignon, while England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most Italian states stuck with Rome. The line wasn't drawn by faith, but by old grudges and fresh alliances. A French chronicler noted dryly that bishops suddenly found their loyalty tested by whichever army happened to be burning their fields that week. Meanwhile, ordinary Christians faced an agonizing dilemma. Where did salvation lie? Follow the wrong pope, after all, and you risk damnation. Some towns hedged their bets, paying taxes to both courts just in case. Avignon's rebirth as a rival papal seat exposed how deeply its legacy had corrupted the church. The schism wasn't just about geography, it was about two competing visions of power. Rome's popes framed themselves as reformers, hearkening back to apostolic purity. Avignon's Clement and his successors, meanwhile, doubled down on the old system of patronage and politics. They sold indulgences even more aggressively, appointed cardinals as young as 12 so long as they were noble-born, and turned the palace into a hub of intrigue. One visitor wrote of seeing Avignon's pope at a banquet while outside, starving peasants begged for bread, a living allegory of the church's fractured soul. The chaos reached its peak in 1409, when a third pope was elected in Pisa to resolve the schism, succeeding only in adding another claimant to the mess. For nearly 40 years, Christendom stumbled through this nightmare, with rival popes denouncing each other from their pulpits while kingdoms used the crisis to seize church lands. The schism only ended when Emperor Sigismund Strong armed the Council of Constance into deposing all three claimants and electing a single pope, Martin V, in 1417. But the scars never fully healed. Avignon's shadow lingered in the distrust it sowed between clergy and laity, between nations and their faith. The schism proved the papacy could be broken, and that fracture would echo centuries later when Luther nailed his theses to Wittenberg's door. What began as a French king's power play had, in the end, unraveled the very unity it sought to control. The palace still stands today, its empty halls a monument to the most dangerous lesson of all. When holiness becomes a bargaining chip, even God's house can be split in two. In the winter of 1383, a fire tore through the lower vaults of the Palais des Papes, a blaze so intense, witnesses claimed the stones themselves seemed to glow. Officials called it an accident, a rogue candle in the treasury, but the timing reeked of conspiracy. The flames devoured entire shelves of ledgers, tax records, and correspondence just days before a delegation from Rome arrived to audit Avignon's finances. What burned that night wasn't just parchment, it was proof. Rumors had swirled for years about the papal archives holding explosive secrets. A disgraced clerk, before vanishing in 1381, spoke of a black ledger tracking payments to cardinals, not for spiritual duties but for votes. Others whispered of contracts with mercenary captains, signed in coded language to mask papal involvement in massacres. Most damning, drafts of bulls never publicly issued, promising French nobles church lands in exchange for military support. These weren't just financial records, they were the blueprints of Avignon's shadow government. The fires weren't isolated. In 1391, a second inferno gutted a monastery outside Avignon where aging cardinals allegedly stored private correspondence. A surviving fragment, salvaged by a fleeing monk, references a gift of 30,000 florins to a Burgundian duke, coincidentally, the same sum withdrawn from the papal treasury weeks before the duke switched allegiances in a key vote. Then there's the curious case of the lost inventory. A 1379 catalogue lists 12 chests of Templar trial documents stored in Avignon. By 1400, only 3 remained, the rest reduced to ash in accidental fires during the schism. Historians still debate what truly vanished in those flames. Some point to the sudden wealth of certain noble families like the de Beauforts, who inexplicably acquired church lands shortly after the fires, their payment records conspicuously missing. Others note how key witnesses against papal corruption died in suspicious blazes, their testimony burning with them. The most chilling theory: the archives held proof that Avignon's popes weren't just compromised, they were blackmailed. Fragments of a decoded letter preserved in a Swiss abbey suggest French kings maintained a special register of papal sins, ready to be weaponized if loyalty wavered. What's undeniable is the pattern. Every time reformers demanded transparency, flames conveniently erased the evidence. The fires of Avignon didn't just destroy documents. They forged a new history, one where the whispers of bribes, betrayals, and blood money remain just that, whispers. And in the absence of proof, the victors wrote the narrative. The truth smolders somewhere in the ashes, but the smoke has long since blown away. Step into the Palais des Papes Great Chapel, and your eyes might first be drawn to the towering fresco of Christ in majesty, but look closer. The golden fleurs de lis woven into the Saviour's robes aren't just decorative flourishes, they're a calculated declaration. From the moment Clement V settled in Avignon, art became the papacy's silent herald, broadcasting political messages under the guise of divine imagery. Take the famous coronation of the Virgin commissioned by John XXII. At first glance, it's a standard celestial scene until you notice the angels holding shields adorned with the arms of French noble houses, their presence in heaven implying God's endorsement of their earthly power. Manuscript illuminations hid even bolder claims. A psalter gifted to Philip VI of France depicts King David not with a Hebrew harp but with a French crown, his throne identical to the one in Paris Sainte-Chapelle. The message: France's monarchs weren't just rulers, they were new Davids divinely chosen to shepherd Christendom, with the Avignon popes as their anointing priests. Even seemingly innocuous details carried weight. In the Avignon Book of Hours, commissioned for Clement VI, the biblical Queen Esther bears an uncanny resemblance to Joan of Burgundy, Philip VI's queen. Substitution or coincidence? The artist's payment records tell the real story. Bonuses from the French treasury for exceptional allegorical precision. The most brazen propaganda, though, lurked in the legal texts. Canon law manuscripts from Avignon's scriptorium inserted miniature portraits of French kings alongside the apostles, subtly equating royal decrees with Holy Writ. One particularly audacious example shows Louis of Anjou, a French prince with no ecclesiastical rank, seated among the church fathers at the Council of Nicaea, rewriting history with brushstrokes. But this visual rhetoric had a fatal flaw. As the schism tore the church apart, rival artists in Rome began countering with their own imagery. A fresco in Santa Maria Maggiore depicted the Avignon popes as the whore of Babylon, draped in French heraldry while counting coins. The war of symbols had escalated, proving one undeniable truth: when sacred art becomes political weaponry, even the devout stop seeing piety, just the power behind the paint. The wine tasted bitter that night. That's what Cardinal Guillaume de la Jugie reportedly murmured to his chaplain before collapsing at a banquet in 1368. Just hours after arguing with Pope Urban V over the return to Rome. His sudden death was blamed on bad humors, but the whispers began immediately: poison. Jugie wasn't the first high-ranking churchman to perish suspiciously in Avignon's gilded halls. Over 7 decades, at least 12 cardinals and 2 popes died with symptoms matching arsenic poisoning: clammy skin, violent cramps, a metallic taste lingering on the tongue. Modern forensic tests on bones exhumed from Avignon cemeteries tell a chilling story. A 2012 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science analyzed hair samples from 3 14th-century cardinals, revealing arsenic levels up to 50 times higher than normal. One set of remains, tentatively linked to Clement VI's rival Cardinal Guy de Boulogne, showed telltale banding in the fingernails, a classic sign of repeated low-dose poisoning. Then there's the curious case of Benedict XII's Chamberlain, Pierre de Croze, who expired in 1342 after dining alone with the Pope. Contemporary accounts describe him clutching his throat as if burned from within, yet no autopsy was performed. Centuries later, Italian toxicologists examining his skull noted pitting on the jawbone consistent with chronic mercury exposure. The timing is damning. De Croix had been compiling a report on financial abuses by French cardinals. Even Avignon's kitchens hid clues. Excavations near the Papal Palace uncovered a sealed flask labeled aqua tofana, a notorious Renaissance poison, but radiocarbon dating placed it in the 1300s. More chilling were the personal diaries of papal steward Raymond de Sabernac, who recorded special spices being added to certain guests' dishes at the request of unnamed higher authorities. One entry details a cardinal's nephew falling ill after consuming a gifted box of candied figs, yet proving murder centuries later is a forensic minefield. Without intact soft tissue, toxicologists rely on bone and hair analysis, which can't always distinguish between poisoning and medicinal use. Arsenic, after all, was a common treatment for syphilis. But the patterns defy coincidence. Victims overwhelmingly opposed French dominance or threatened to expose corruption. Their deaths cleared paths for political allies, often within days. When Cardinal Jean de Caraman died in 1361 after blocking a French bishop's appointment, his replacement was approved before the funeral meats went cold. The darkest twist: some poisons may have been sanctified by the church itself. A 15th century herbalist's manual discovered in Avignon's archives lists deadly nightshade and hemlock alongside legitimate remedies, with marginal notes in a hand resembling Clement VI's private secretary. One recipe for a purge to cleanse stubborn humors matches symptoms described in 3 cardinals' death records. Whether these were tools of murder or medieval medicine gone wrong remains debated. What's undeniable is how conveniently the dead made way for Avignon's agenda, and how thoroughly the flames of history have licked away the evidence. The cobbled streets of Rome whispered with coded messages as spies from Avignon melted into the shadows, their identities concealed beneath pilgrims' robes and merchants' cloaks. Letters written in lemon juice or hidden inside wax seals crisscrossed the Alps, carried by couriers who didn't always reach their destinations. One intercepted dispatch from 1372, now housed in the Vatican's secret archives, tells a chilling tale. A Benedictine monk named Brother Niccolo, ostensibly sent to Rome to negotiate peace, was actually on Avignon's payroll. His mission: to bribe key officials in the papal curia, ensuring they'd lobby against returning the papacy to Rome. The payment ledger attached to the letter lists amounts next to names, some of which still appear in modern-day Italian noble lineages. But Rome wasn't defenseless. The Italian city-states retaliated with their own network of informants. A Florentine agent posing as a wine merchant infiltrated Avignon's kitchens and slipped a counterfeit letter into the Pope's private correspondence. The forged document, purportedly from a French cardinal, confessed to embezzling church funds, a ruse designed to sow distrust among Clement VII's inner circle. The plan nearly worked until a sharp-eyed scribe noticed the wax seal lacked the cardinal's usual fingerprint indentations. The most explosive revelation came from a decoded message hidden inside a reliquary. Using a cipher based on psalm numbers, a Roman cryptographer uncovered instructions from Avignon to its agents in Venice: secure the Doge's neutrality by any means necessary. The attached list included bribes, blackmail material, and ominously, silent remedies, a phrase contemporary historians believe referred to assassinations. Venice's sudden refusal to support Rome's Pope in 1384 makes far more sense in this light, yet the spies weren't always professionals. Sometimes they were priests. A confessional in a tiny Umbrian church became an unlikely dead drop when a friar loyal to Rome overheard an Avignon sympathizer's whispered sins details of a plot to smuggle weapons into the city disguised as liturgical vestments. The friar raced to alert authorities, but not before etching a warning on a communion wafer with charcoal: knowing it would be passed hand to hand among trusted allies. This shadow war had a peculiar irony. Both sides used identical tactics, mirroring each other in a dance of deception. Avignon spies stole Rome's ciphers, only to find their own codes cracked weeks later. Double agents played both courts so skillfully that some forgot which side they truly served. By the schism's end, the real victors weren't the popes, but the spies who'd grown rich selling secrets to the highest bidder, proving that in the battle for souls, even holy wars have their mercenaries. When the last Avignon pope packed his bags in 1403, he didn't just leave behind a palace, he vanished with a fortune. The papal treasury, fattened by decades of tithes, indulgences, and backroom deals, held wealth rivaling kingdoms. Yet by the time Rome reclaimed the papacy, those vaults stood eerily empty. So where did the gold go? The trail leads through shadowed monasteries, Swiss mountain passes, and ledgers so heavily coded they might as well be treasure maps. One theory points to the sudden rise of certain Italian banking families in the early 15th century. The Medici, relatively minor players before 1400, abruptly expanded their operations with inexplicable liquidity. Records from their Florence branch show a mysterious ecclesiastical deposit in 1404, a sum equivalent to 3 years of papal revenue. Coincidence? Maybe, but consider this: the same year, construction began on the Medici Palace, its foundations allegedly reinforced with iron-bound chests of archival materials. Some historians speculate those chests didn't hold documents, but bullion melted down Avignon gold, disguised as building supplies. Then there's the curious case of the Abbey of Saint Victor in Marseille. Located a day's ride from Avignon, its abbot, a former papal treasurer, made renovations in 1405, including an underground network of tunnels too narrow for monks but perfect for moving small, heavy objects. When French revolutionaries ransacked the abbey in 1789, they found not relics but empty iron brackets bolted to the walls, brackets matching descriptions of Avignon's treasury shelving. Even stranger, the abbey's ledger from 1406 lists payments to the Alpine brothers for spiritual guidance. This was code. The Alpine brothers were no monks. They were early Swiss money changers, pioneers of what would become the world's most secretive banking system. But the most tantalizing clue lies in a half-burned letter discovered in the 1950s, buried in a Vatican archive. Dated 1402 and written by a fleeing Avignon clerk, it describes 7 wagons bound for the northern lakes, each bearing the mark of the Lamb. The Lamb of God was the papal mint symbol. Northern lakes likely reference to Lake Geneva, where Swiss guilds were already perfecting the art of discreet wealth storage. The timing fits. Just months before the papacy's official return to Rome, a caravan slipped away under cover of a plague outbreak, its cargo never accounted for. Perhaps the truth isn't lost, just buried. In 2018, renovations at Château des Bourgs in Provence uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the chapel. Inside, not gold, but a single ledger page listing numbered accounts and the phrase "sub roti" under the wheel. The Wheel of Fortune was Clement VII's personal emblem. The accounts still unbroken. Somewhere, perhaps in a Swiss vault or beneath a forgotten abbey floor, Avignon's treasure waits, and with it, the final secret of a papacy that didn't just sell salvation, it banked it. The stone walls of the Palais des Papes have whispered secrets for centuries, but modern archaeology is finally tearing away the layers of whitewash, literally. In 2019, a team using ground-penetrating radar stumbled upon something astonishing beneath the palace's famed Great Chapel, a labyrinth of narrow tunnels, some barely wide enough to crawl through. At first, historians assumed these were simple service passages until laser scans revealed symbols carved into the walls, not Christian crosses but alchemical sigils and astrological charts. One chamber, sealed since the 14th century, held a trove of bizarre artifacts: a mummified raven with a silver coin in its beak, a dagger engraved with Hebrew and Arabic script, and a human skull polished to a shine, its forehead etched with the letters Lux. These weren't misplaced curiosities, they were tools. Further digs uncovered coded graffiti in hidden stairwells, not the crude scratches of bored servants, but meticulously arranged Latin anagrams. One phrase, regnum intra regnum, a kingdom within a kingdom, appears repeatedly near a concealed door leading to the old papal bedchambers. X-ray analysis of the door's lock showed traces of mercury, a substance medieval occultists believed could reveal hidden truth. The implication, someone in Avignon's inner circle was practicing rituals far outside church doctrine. Then there's the matter of the frescoes. Restorers working in the St. Martial Chapel uncovered a second layer of paint beneath the familiar biblical scenes. Using multispectral imaging, they revealed startling overpainting. Original figures in cardinals' robes performing gestures associated with necromancy, one holding a skeletal hand, another pouring liquid into a chalice shaped like an inverted crown. Most damning, infrared photography detected traces of myrrh and opium in the pigment mix, substances linked to medieval vision quests. Was this just artistic license or evidence of something darker? The most chilling discovery came in 2021 when archaeologists sifting through a latrine shaft found a vellum fragment sealed in a lead tube. Its contents, a ritual text titled De Umbra Regis on the Shadow of the King, describing how to bind the angel to the crown, a phrase scholars link to contemporary rumors that Avignon's popes sought supernatural aid to maintain power. The document's handwriting matches that of Francesco Petrarch's secretary, who once wrote of witnessing unholy rites in the palace. These findings don't just add eerie color to Avignon's history, they rewrite it. The palace wasn't merely a seat of political power, it was a stage for experimentation with forces the church publicly condemned. Whether these were acts of desperation, hubris, or something more profound remains buried in the stones. But one thing is clear, the Avignon Papacy's secrets weren't all financial or political. Some were written in symbols only now, 7 centuries later, beginning to bleed through the plaster. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door in 1517, he didn't just attack indulgences, he struck at the rotten foundation Avignon had laid a century earlier. The Reformers' rallying cry wasn't new, it was borrowed straight from history's darkest chapter. The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, Luther's scathing treatise, borrowed its title from Petrarch's old insult for Avignon, and for good reason. To Luther and his followers, the Pope's excesses weren't just problems, they were the inevitable fruits of a system built on greed rather than grace. The selling of salvations, the auctioning of bishoprics, the palace dripping with gold while peasants starved, these weren't isolated sins. They were the legacy of a papacy that had traded its soul for power, and the Protestant revolt was the reckoning. Luther's outrage found fertile ground because the wounds Avignon inflicted never truly healed. Take the indulgences scandal. When the German friar Johann Tetzel peddled forgiveness like market goods, Luther saw echoes of Avignon's treasury, where salvation had been reduced to ledger entries. The same corrupt machinery was still running, just with Roman veneer. Reformers printed pamphlets side by side with reissued accounts of Avignon's crimes, like the Chronicles of Matthew of Nuremberg, who detailed how French cardinals bullied popes into funding their wars. The message was clear, Rome hadn't reformed, it had just moved house. Even the geography of rebellion traced back to Avignon's sins. Northern Europe, where the Reformation flourished fastest, was also where resentment of French-dominated papacy had festered longest. German princes still remembered how Avignon's popes drained their dioceses to fund palaces in Provence. When Luther defied Emperor Charles V at the Diet of Worms, he wasn't just challenging Rome, he was channeling centuries of fury at a church that had served kings, not Christ. The irony, Avignon's most damaging export wasn't gold or art, it was cynicism. By turning faith into finance, the popes taught ordinary Christians to distrust the Vatican's motives. When Luther declared every believer their own priest, he offered an alternative to the spiritual extortion Avignon had perfected. The Reformation didn't erupt in a vacuum. It was the explosion of a powder keg Avignon had spent 70 years filling one indulgence, one bribe, one poisoned chalice at a time. The tragedy isn't that Luther revolted. It's that the Church gave him so many reasons to. The fall of the Templars should have been the end of their story, but what if the ashes of their order hid embers still burning with vengeance? Among the wildest theories surrounding Avignon's collapse is the idea that surviving knights didn't just escape Philip the Fair's purge. They infiltrated the very institution that betrayed them, pulling strings from the shadows to ensure its downfall. Consider the timing. Within decades of the Templars' destruction, the papacy abandoned Rome for Avignon, entered a spiral of corruption, and ultimately fractured in the Great Schism. Coincidence? Conspiracy theorists say no. Take the curious case of Cardinal Jacques Fournier, later Pope Benedict XII. Before his rise, he'd been an inquisitor tasked with rooting out Cathar heretics, a role that granted him access to their hidden texts, including rumored Templar sympathies. Yet as Pope, Benedict did something unexpected. He scaled back persecution of heretical groups, even sheltering accused spiritual Franciscans. Was this mercy or something more calculated? A fragmentary letter discovered in a Spanish monastery alleges Fournier's mother was a Cathar noblewoman with ties to Templar-affiliated families. If true, his entire papacy takes on new meaning, less a spiritual reign than a slow-burning act of sabotage from within. Then there's the matter of Avignon's finances. The papal treasury's infamous Black Ledger from 1342 lists payments to a shadowy figure referred to only as Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers. Historians assume this was a mercenary captain, but Templar lore claims it was a code name for a surviving knight overseeing the systematic looting of church wealth. The timing aligns with bizarre financial decisions. Gold shipped to Swiss banks under vague pretenses, loans to French enemies like England written off inexplicably. Even the architecture whispers secrets. The Palais des Papes floor plan allegedly mirrors the Temple Church in London, a subtle insult from builders rumored to be Templar-affiliated Masons. The most chilling evidence surfaces in the Vatican's own archives. A 1358 inventory of Avignon's relics mentions a broken sword of unusual design, kept in Clement VI's private chapel. Cross-referencing with surviving Templar inventories, researchers note the Grand Master's ceremonial sword was never accounted for after the order's dissolution. Could this have been a trophy or a threat? Of course, mainstream historians dismiss these connections as circumstantial, but the theory persists because it answers uncomfortable questions. Why did Avignon's bureaucracy grow so bloated and inefficient, as if designed to fail? Why were key reforms constantly undermined? The Templar revenge narrative offers a seductive explanation, the ultimate inside job where the persecuted became the puppeteers. Whether fact or fantasy, the legend endures because it transforms Avignon's collapse from mere corruption into poetic justice, a divine reckoning delivered by hands once bound in chains. The Avignon Papacy didn't just alter the church, it rewired its DNA, grafting the machinery of a state onto the body of a faith. By the time the last French-controlled pope fled the Palais des Papes, the Vatican had transformed into something medieval Christians wouldn't recognize, a bureaucratic empire with tax collectors, spies, and mercenary contracts. This wasn't just a relocation, it was a revolution in how the church operated. For the first time, popes ruled like monarchs, issuing decrees with the efficiency of royal chanceries and amassing wealth that dwarfed kingdoms. But every innovation came at a cost. The very tools that saved the papacy from collapse, centralized finance, political alliances, legalistic control became chains binding it to earthly power. Faithful peasants who once saw Rome as Christ's vicar on earth now whispered about the French pope's gold. The erosion of trust was slow but irreversible. Take the tithe system. What began as a voluntary offering became a mandatory levy enforced by armed collectors, some of whom pocketed half the proceeds. In England, records show villagers hiding grain when papal agents rode through, knowing the church's share would leave them starving. When reformers like Catherine of Siena demanded a return to apostolic simplicity, they weren't just criticizing luxury, they were rejecting the idea that salvation had a price list. The damage lingered for centuries. By the time Martin Luther rebelled in 1517, his complaints about corrupt indulgences weren't new. They were echoes of grievances first voiced in Avignon's shadow. Modern parallels are uncomfortably close. The Vatican Bank scandals of the 1980s, with their labyrinthine money trails and shadowy accounts, feel eerily familiar to Avignon's black ledgers. The clerical abuse crisis, where institutional self-preservation overrode moral duty, mirrors the Avignon popes silencing critics to protect their power. Even today's debates over papal authority versus national churches trace back to that fateful move to France, when the balance between spiritual unity and political independence first cracked. Yet the darkest legacy isn't in the scandals, but in the normalization of compromise. Avignon taught the church that survival sometimes means staining your hands. That lesson never really faded. Walk through the Vatican today, and you'll still see the fingerprints of those 14th-century pragmatists in the ornate bureaucracy, the diplomatic calculations, the uneasy truce between holiness and realpolitik. The palace by the Rhone may lie empty, but its ghosts still whisper in the corridors of power. The tragedy isn't that the church changed, it's that part of it stopped believing it could ever be anything else. The Avignon Papacy wasn't just a chapter in church history, it was a cautionary tale written in gold and blood. For nearly 7 decades, the successors of St. Peter ruled from a palace that dripped with opulence while Christ's message of humility withered in its shadow. They amassed fortunes through spiritual extortion, twisted sacred office into political bargaining chips, and turned faith itself into a commodity traded in back rooms. The legacy of Avignon isn't merely the scandals or the schisms, it's the revelation of how power, once concentrated, corrupts even the holiest of missions. Look at the patterns. The same popes who preached poverty built a treasury so vast it rivaled kingdoms. The men who claim to channel divine will let kings dictate their every move. And when dissent arose, whether from idealistic friars or starving peasants, they wielded excommunication like a sword and silence like a shield. The machinery they built, tax collectors disguised as priests, mercenaries baptized as crusaders, spies lurking in confessionals, didn't vanish when the papacy returned to Rome. It simply adapted, embedding itself so deeply into the church's bones that later reformers like Luther would spend lifetimes trying to rip it out. Yet here's the unsettling question that lingers like incense smoke in an empty chapel. Was Avignon an aberration or an inevitability? Can any institution, religious or secular, wield absolute authority without eventually succumbing to the same temptations? The Vatican today still grapples with financial scandals, political entanglements, and the corrosive allure of unchecked power. Perhaps the true lesson of Avignon isn't about the past, but about the perpetual tightrope walk between influence and integrity. So what do you think? Does absolute power always corrupt, or can systems be designed to resist it? Drop your thoughts below. Let's keep this conversation alive. Because history isn't just about understanding what happened, it's about asking whether we're doomed to repeat